All right, we talked about trigger nodes, logic nodes, data nodes, and now we are on to output nodes. You can use output nodes to send data out of the workflow engine. You can send a device command to a listening device, an email to a technician, a text message to yourself, perform an API call, and a whole lot more. Let's talk about some of the popular output nodes.
First and foremost, the debug node is the workflow builder's savior. We've already talked about this one and used it a bunch, but there is one tip that I wanted to show you in this chapter. As you use the debug node, you're going to start to get a lot of messages in the debug panel. It might be hard to know exactly what payload path caused this particular debug message. So check this out. If you hover over the message in the debug panel, the path that triggered this message is highlighted over to the left. This is most useful if the message that appeared in the debug panel is an error. So then you can see exactly what payload path caused that error. After this, I think you know just about all there is about the debug node. So let's talk about another popular output node, the device state node. By now, I hope you understand that state is different from other messages coming into LoSANT. Unlike other messages, we save the state data so you can query it later, like we saw in the last chapter. Devices that connect via MQTT report state by using the state topic. But what happens if a device doesn't connect via MQTT? How do they report state? And that's really where the device node comes in. You can use this node to report state from essentially any trigger coming into a LoSANT workflow. So no matter how your device is sending data to us, you can use this node to always report state. Let's build a simple workflow to see how this works. When we open up the device state node, we have three main configuration options. We need to select a device, choose some attributes, and we have to configure a time. For the device state node, we can only report state for one device at a time. So this isn't our handy dandy device picker. We can only pick one device. On the other hand, we can configure a device via a payload path. Next, we need to configure which attributes we want to report for this device. Here, we have three options to do so. First, we can just specify a key value pair, which attributes we like to update. Or we can build out a JSON object ourselves using the JSON template option. Lastly, we can choose a payload path that contains our data. The last configuration bit for this node is time. By default, it will use the time of the current workflow payload that's being processed, which is just the time that the workflow was triggered. Or you can choose the current time. This time represents the time that the device node was executed. The time that this node was executed will often be the same as the time that the workflow was triggered, but not always. It really depends on what you have going on between the trigger and the device state node itself. But most of the time, these two values will be virtually the same. Lastly, you can use a payload that contains a timestamp to also give it a time that you want. Let's bring everything together to see how the device node is helpful. I've seen workflows that are triggered from a webhook, and in the body of the webhook, they generally contain some sort of ID or device identifier and the state data we want to report. Then this workflow can look up that device using the device get node. After that, we can use a device state node to report state data on the device ID we just found using that device get node. So this is a really good example of data not coming through MQTT. It's coming from a webhook request. So let's move on to our next output node, the device command output node. In the devices course, we talked about device commands. Using the LoSANT MQTT libraries, devices can listen for commands from LoSANT and act upon them. So, as an example, in LoSANT's office, all of our lights are controlled by a Raspberry Pi we've set up as a gateway. This gateway is listening to LoSANT as a device and ready to receive commands. It expects a JSON payload with two properties. Lights. We have multiple lights installed, so this is going to specify which light we want to control. The other is state. This is the state of the light we want to take place. This will simply be a 1 or 0 for on and off. Here is how I have everything set up. When my Pi receives a command from Losan, the firmware that I wrote will send a command to the Wemo switches we have in the office. Let's use the device command node to send this Pi a message to turn on the lights. To make this easy, we can drag a virtual button and a device command node to the palette. Then configure the device command node. Here we have our handy dandy device picker. So we can send a command to one device, multiple devices, or even devices by tag. And just as our other nodes, we can specify devices by payload path. Next, we can input a command name. I'm just going to put my light command here. Next, we can choose the payload type. Like I said before, the Pi I have set up in the office is expecting a JSON payload. So let's choose that here. But you also have the option to send a simple string, for example, or specify a payload path to send to your device. Lastly, I want to configure the JSON command that's being sent to the device. Keep in mind that this field is also templatable. Once you are done configuring, we can deploy and press the virtual button. Then my Pi will receive this command and turn the light we configured on. So now you know how to send messages back down to your device using this device command node.
Overall, you have a bunch of outputs to use in the workflow engine. Play around with them and let me know if you have any questions in the forums. I'll see you in the next video.